Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. Starting at the beginning of 2025, I've made a video each month talking about 8 books that are scheduled for publication, at least in the US, that month. Today I want to do a slight expansion, 10 books that will be released in May. As I say every month, there are several great booktubers who make regular videos along the same line. But rather than talking about books likely to make a big splash, like the new Mark Twain biography, for example, I usually put together a pretty idiosyncratic list based only on my own quirky obsessions and personal taste. A list that doesn't rule out literary hits, but certainly doesn't heavily lean into that category. I hope a few of these might intrigue you and also not be on every other list you've seen. The first book, coming out on May 1st, is Georgia and Anita, The Lifelong Friendship of Georgia O'Keeffe and Anita Pollitzer by Liza Bennett. This is the story of a lifelong friendship that, as the publicity materials say, had a tremendous impact on both women and on 20th century America. Pollitzer was the first person to show Georgia O'Keeffe's artwork to the famous photographer Alfred Stieglitz, who was a central figure in the modern art world where O'Keeffe found herself. Pollitzer herself became a leader in the National Women's Party and an advocate for the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote. This biography of the friendship between the two women is based on the correspondence between them, 50 years worth of letters. These are two people who played important roles, very different roles, in the coming of modernism, one in the art world and one in the social and political world. Their friendship, including its painful end, sounds like an intriguing way to approach that topic. On May the 6th, coming from Harvard University Press, is a book I'm pretty excited about, ELLMANN'S JOYCE, the biography of a masterpiece and its maker by Zachary Lida. I say May 6th, but you may have seen on Pat's channel, Book Chat with Pat, that the book seems to be already out in the world, at least in some places. Anyway, this book is a different kind of biography, the biography of a biography, or perhaps a biography of a biographer. That is, it's an account of how the literary critic and scholar Richard Ellmann came to write what Anthony Burgess called the greatest biography in the 20th century. In addition to laying out how Ellmann researched his topic, Lida also writes not only how Ellmann shaped the way readers around the world think about Joyce, but also about how the process of writing a major literary biography works. He gives us a tour of publishing houses in New York and London, as well as in classrooms and elite universities, etc. And on top of that, I gather Lida's book has a bit of literary criticism of both Joyce and Ellmann. Okay, on to another book coming out on May 6th, Melting Point, Family, Memory, and the Search for a Promised Land by Rachel Cockerell. This one sounds really fascinating. It's a very different kind of Zionist story from the one we usually hear about. This is the story of a group of 10,000 Russian Jewish refugees who had been subject to anti-Semitic violence in Eastern Europe in the lead up to World War I and were forced to flee. The first group set sail in 1907 to find a new home, not in Jerusalem, but in America, and not in New York City, but in Texas. The journey was the start of what has been called the Galveston movement. From there, the immigrants could move further west by train. This is the story of how they confronted the issue of whether to hold on to their own cultural traditions rooted in the past or to blend into the melting pot of their new surroundings. Quote, "It's a story that asks what it means to belong and what can be salvaged from the past." Robert Macfarlane is one of the number of literary stars who've endorsed this book. He calls it a remarkable book. And Antonia Fraser calls it utterly compelling. I haven't looked at this text yet, but I gather it's a bit of an experimental kind of biography, built as a pastiche of primary material. The author stitches together the historical sources, diaries and letters, interviews, speeches, newspaper, etc. that she's collected in ways that pre-publication reviewers on NetGalley, at least, have either loved or really resisted. In fact, I'm going to read just a bit of a NetGalley review. The reader argues that once we get involved in a particular storyline, it might suddenly stop. And then, quote, "We're off to the next snippet, yes, cut and stitched together like a would-be tailor learning to sew." Here's another one. "Personally, it reminded me of long nights confronted by hundreds of note-scrawled index cards as I desperately tried to organize and transform them into a coherent college paper." I can't wait to see what I think myself of this book, which has received such support by some readers, but also such intense dismissal by others, not because of its argument, but because of its narrative and stylistic choices. Coming out on May 13th from Knopf is an essay collection by the novelist Richard Russo, Life and Art. This collection considers how these two ideas inform each other as we think about our understanding of the world around us. According to the publicist's materials, Russo, quote, "reflects on the implacable fact that writers use people, insisting that what matters in the end is how and for what purpose." He's interested in how people think about what they know and what they don't know and what they can't know, as well as why we as humans feel compelled to tell stories. All of that sounds quite abstract, very nonspecific, but the essays are really quite personal, sharp, and extraordinarily intimate, as the pub sheet says. For example, one of the life essays revolves around a discussion of a family rift between family members who supported COVID mitigation efforts and relatives who chose to remain unvaccinated. A lot of the essays are about the most intense COVID years, as well as ill health in general, actually. His father's cancer, his mother's mental health, etc. What feels most lasting is a question embodied in several of these essays. How do our past experiences make us who we think we are? And how do untold stories, family secrets, impact us as individuals living within community? The second half of the book feels a bit less cohesive, at least on my very preliminary skim through. The essays are about art, from popular songs to popular movies. All right, the next book is Wild Thing, A Life of Paul Gauguin by Sue Prideaux, also to be published on May 13th and released by W.W. Norton. This biography of the French post-impressionist artist will make an excellent choice for the BookTube Art Readathon framed in September if you haven't already filled your dance card. I think it's already been released in the UK, but I'm not certain. The biography looks at Paul Gauguin's reputation as a transgressive genius, as the pub sheet says, a reputation that developed from both his biography and his unconventional art, using imagery of indigenous people and culture, especially from Polynesia. Prideaux argues that Gauguin wasn't nearly as transgressive as his reputation suggested. Based on newly available primary material, the author disproves previous assumptions, such as the idea that Gauguin had syphilis. Instead, she suggests that he tried to escape the bustle of Paris for the simple, quiet life of the beautiful Tahiti. While he was there, he found himself fighting against French colonialism and for indigenous rights. Gauguin was a visionary artist, and he had an enormous influence on other artists of this time, from Vincent van Gogh to Matisse and Picasso. A couple of interesting books come out on May 20th. First is No Straight Road Takes You There, Essays for Uneven Terrain by Rebecca Solnit. I have been so impressed by the work of Solnit that I've read so far. Her brain works in an incredibly wide-ranging way. I reviewed her Orwell's Roses for the online journal On the Seawall, I believe, and I'll leave a link to that review down in the description box. In this new book, Solnit uses that very same broad vision. In fact, the first essay is about what a 300-year-old violin can tell us about climate change. And in future essays, she addresses such timely topics as democracy and hope and power and its abuse. She's interested in the tropes we fall into, the stories we've told so many times that we no longer evaluate their truth. She wants to find new ways to go forward that might be both effective and sustainable. Her essays never feel dogmatic, but are instead brilliant and thoughtful and welcoming, even when they seem to go in a million different directions. As I think she might say, you never quite know which of those million directions will lead to insight, or to justice, to social transformation. To conclude this book, let me read just a few short clips. First, from this review in The Guardian, you can see what it is I fell in love with in Orwell's Roses. Quote, "It's impossible not to be carried along on her offbeat philosophical detours." Bill McKibben says, quote, "No writer has better understood the mix of fear and possibility, peril and exuberance that's marked this new era." And here's one from the pub sheet. In the spirit of her best-selling book, Hope in the Dark, Rebecca Solnit explores how our actions can shape the future and the liberatory possibilities of embracing uncertainty. Another book coming on the 20th is Things in Nature Merely Grow by Yiyun Li, to be published by Farrar, Straus and Giroux. This book starts with this line: "There is no good way to say this." What Yiyun Li wants to tell us is indeed tremendously hard. She and her husband had 2 children, as she says, and lost both of them. One in 2017 at the age of 16, and one in 2024 at 19. And she explains right away that both chose suicide, which is her choice of wording. Let me read from the pub sheet. "There is no good way to say this, because words fall short. It takes only an instant for death to become fact, a single point in a timeline. Living now on this single point, Lee turns to thinking and reasoning and searching for words that might hold a place for James. Lee does what she can, doing the things that work, including not just writing but gardening, reading Camus and Wittgenstein, learning the piano, and living thinkingly alongside death." And here's a quote from Yiyun Li herself. "I am against the word grief, which in contemporary culture seems to indicate a process that has an end point. The sooner you get there, the sooner you prove yourself to be a good sport at living, and the less awkward people around you will feel. Sometimes people ask me where I am in the grieving process, and I wonder whether they understand anything at all about losing someone." I read a lot of books about death and dying and about grief, partly because Yiyun Li's stunning literary abilities, and partly because she seems to be willing to be deeply honest and open here. I have a feeling that this one will be one like Joan Didion's 2 grief memoirs that will resonate for a long time. Okay, the following week, on the 27th of May, comes Carpet Diem, Tales from the World of Oriental Rugs by George Bradley, coming out from Harper. I admit I have a special reason for being excited about this book. In a recent video, I talked about my brother's recent wedding. This spring, there have been quite a few other reasons why I've been thinking about him, and a few of those things are recent or forthcoming books that discuss subjects with which he has long been fascinated. One is the hippie trail. So when Rick Steves' account of his travels along the hippie trail came out, I was eager to pick it up. I'll be talking about reading it in a future video. And then I heard about a book about the Grateful Dead, an academic book talking about how people passed around informal recordings of their live shows and why that mattered. And now there is this one. I'm not quite sure what got my brother interested in Oriental rugs, but even as a very little boy, maybe 5 or 6 years old, is that possible? He was obsessed with how the rugs were made, what various patterns or styles indicated, regional variation, etc. So when I saw this book on NetGalley, I immediately requested it. The book is an account of the history of rugs, including how and why they were made, a discussion of how they are now marketed and sold, and what the pub sheet calls a humorous meditation on the author's desire to collect them. as I often do for pub sheet quotes that might seem a little over the top, I will read this one. Quote, "A narrative that combines the mesmerizing storytelling found in the Arabian Nights with the pilgrimage into history that unfolds in the Silk Road and the dramatic compulsion to possess rare elegance that propels the orchid thief, Carpet Diem is an unusual and charming memoir that testifies to the intricate beauty woven into our world." Coming out from Spiegel and Grau is Forest Euphoria, The Abounding Queerness of Nature by Patricia Kaishian. The fact that Margaret Wrinkle, whose nature books I really love, calls Forest Euphoria, quote, "a masterclass in how to love the world," is really quite enough for me to pick up this book. It traces the making of a scientist through a childhood of exploring the swamps and creatures around her home in the foothills of New York State. She eventually grows up to be a mycologist, and she has explained elsewhere that queer mycology, in her usage, refers to the complexities of the organisms she studies, which humans might not anticipate due to the apparently human tendency to apply simple, clear-cut categorizations to the entire spectrum of life. The author braids together this idea of more fluid categorization within the world of mycology and other species, including eels and slugs, among many others, with her own sense of self. As a young person, she slowly came to understand that her sense of gender and sexual orientation is, as she says, shifty. And she felt she didn't fit into some of the other boxes our society tends to ask us to check. For example, she's both neurodivergent and racially ambiguous, her wording there. Kaishian suggests that loosening our grip on our insistence of binaries and boxes allows us to see life in a more full and vibrant way. But more than the literal transcendence of supposed boundaries, queer in this book means something bigger. As she writes, quote, "Queerness invites us all, regardless of our identities, to be more undefined, unclear, transitional, merging, interdependent, cooperative, and non-hierarchical, a very fungal way of being." I want to pair this book with a book that came out in January of this year from Stanford University Press, which honestly sounds much more up my alley than Forest Euphoria does. Rachel Carson and the Power of Queer Love by Lida Maxwell. In Rachel Carson's case, argues Maxwell's book, Silent Spring, quote, "grew from the love these women shared for their wild surroundings, and vitally and increasingly for each other." The author's account of their relationship is grounded in the women's letters to each other, and she argues that their love for each other opened up for Carson what the pub sheet calls a more powerful space for critique, including a critique of capitalism and its impact on not only human lives but on the environment. So where Forest Euphoria shows us how the natural world helped the author come to terms with her own ideas about her personal identity, the Rachel Carson book shows us how same-sex love allowed Carson to approach her environmentalism in what essentially was a more political way. And finally, one more book coming out on May 27th from the New Press is Art on My Mind, Visual Politics by the incomparable Bell Hooks. Hooks died a few years ago, but her classic Ain't I a Woman was one of the favorite books of so many of my history grad student friends. It was already a decade or so old by the time we were reading it, and it still crackled with intelligence and also a profoundly deep compassion that rarely shows so clearly in academic writing. Unlike Richard Russo's book, which I mentioned earlier in this list, this 30th anniversary edition of Hooks' seminal book is true art criticism. The essays feel deeply personal, but at the heart of each is art, from the work of Basquiat and Lorna Simpson, Carrie Mae Weems, Margot Humphrey, etc. Hooks is interested in how these artists made their art, but also how they were able to sell their work and get it shown in some of the world's greatest museums. She's also interested in the question of how art might function as one part of the struggle for freedom for Black artists and women artists and others. Let me read from the pub sheet. Art of My Mind is essential reading for anyone looking to find lessons on liberation and creativity in the world of color, the free world of art. And let me also share a quote from a review in Paper magazine. In a world obsessed with identity politics, Art of My Mind is a long overdue rescue of the liberating rather than confining power of art. All right, that will do it for this list. Lots of interesting choices coming out in May. I assume I will be making a similar list for books that are forthcoming in June, and I'll try to get that video out right around the start of the new month. Happy reading to all of you. See you soon here on Hannah's Books.